The wind sliced across the snow-laden fields of the north, carrying whispers of ice and rust. Once, these same winds howled through the broken ramparts of the wall, heralding terror. But now the realm was caught in a fragile lull. Jon Snow had been named king in the north by his people. Ragged men and women who had lived through 1,000 tragedies but refused to kneel to despair. Queen Daenerys Targaryen stood as an uneasy ally, her dragons a living threat of fire incarnate, perched at the edges of the northern sky. Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell, held the seat of her forebears, tirelessly striving for unity among lords who had seen too many faces of betrayal. Arya Stark lurked in the shadows, unwavering and lethal in her devotion to family. Bran Stark, young, haunted, burdened with powers beyond mortal comprehension, gazed at the tapestry of time with eyes made old by visions. The war with the army of the dead had ravaged the living. The battles had left scars upon the land deeper than any plow could gouge. Bodies once fell in tides, rising again with eyes of ice-blue cruelty. But after the final confrontation at the fields of Winterfell, those who were not turned were left with half a victory. While the White Walkers had been slowed, no one knew for certain if the threat had been extinguished. All that was certain was that the Night King had not been seen among the swirling snow after dawn broke on that fateful morning. Days melted into weeks, weeks into months. The North wrestled with its losses, bodies still being burned in silent tribute to forestall any chance of reanimation. Houses licked their wounds, forging new alliances where they could. It was in the hush of the winter twilight that rumors circulated like shy ghosts. Fleeting sightings of a tall figure with obsidian blue eyes in the haunted forests beyond the Wolf's Wood. Strange sightings of whites standing idle rather than attacking travelers, as though some new, perplexing will guided them. But no one believed the gossip at first. Perhaps the peasants had been spooked by an oddly shaped tree or the reflection of moonlight upon ice. Yet these tales found their way to Winterfell, and the name that lanced the air was one no living being could forget: the Night King. Jon Snow had been in council with Sansa when the news arrived, borne by a half-frozen ranger from the edges of the New Gift. What the ranger managed to stutter between shivers and trembling was not an account of another assault but an entreaty, delivered by a single wight who had not attempted to kill him. The wight had pressed into the ranger's hand a carved chunk of weirwood. Upon it was a crude image of a dire wolf and a symbol reminiscent of the White Walker's mysterious spiral. The ranger spoke of how the wight then collapsed into lifelessness, as though whatever necromantic impulse had animated it simply withdrew. Such tidings set the great hall of Winterfell on edge. Lords demanded swift retaliation. Many had no stomach left for talk of parley or ceasefire. But Jon Snow listened, heart-pounding at the strangeness of it. This was no typical behavior for any undead minion. The Night King had, until that point, commanded only destruction. Yet if some new bargain was being offered, or even teased, the question battered Jon's mind. Why? What could possibly drive the Night King to communicate rather than simply kill? Sansa pressed a hand over the carved weirwood piece, eyes flicking to meet Jon's. She saw the question in him, the unstoppable curiosity that might lead him and everyone else into the jaws of danger once again. Yet she also saw that the realm, even after a partial victory, could not survive another war of attrition. If there was a path that might avert more bloodshed, if by some miracle the others could be turned from adversaries into some manner of ally, impossible though it sounded, Sansa knew Jon would risk himself to find out. Arya watched the proceedings from the side, silent, her face a mask of quiet calculation. She had a knack for reading the hearts of men and women alike. Or, in this case, the heart of the impossible. She said little, but that night she loomed by Bran's doorway, her gaze encouraging her younger brother to work whatever magic the three-eyed raven had left him to search the swirling mists of possibility for answers. But even Bran's gifts had limits. The weirwood carved sigil gave him only glimpses, fragments of the lands of always winter, flashes of an ancient, frigid fortress of ice. He sensed the presence of a being older than human memory, burdened with an emotion that felt almost like desperation. They deliberated for hours in the gloom of Winterfell's council chamber. Daenerys, uneasy after tasting the scalding bitterness of losing a dragon to the Night King's might, was wary. Her stance was unwavering. The Night King was an abomination. He sought no alliances. His attempts at communication must be a ruse. Tyrion and Davos heard her argument and recognized its validity. Yet Davos coughed into his hand and asked, in his plain-spoken way, if the living truly had the numbers or resources to fight should the dead rise in full again. Tyrion's clever mind turned over the bizarre prospect. If the Night King were a chess piece on the board, what advantage might drive him to this? The swirl of speculation revealed no clarity. In the end, it was Jon who decided. He couldn't forget standing at Hardhome watching the dead surge forward at the Night King's command. He couldn't forget the terror. But if there was the slightest chance to avoid a second war with a foe that was nearly unstoppable, he had to try. Perhaps reason could be found in even the darkest corners of existence. Perhaps not, but he wouldn't rest without exploring the path. So it was settled Jon Snow, king in the north, would venture beyond Winterfell's walls with a small party of trusted allies. They would go to the place designated by the carved symbol, a clearing in the Wolfswood near the edge of an ancient, desolate barrow field. For nights later, under a sky star-pocked and mercilessly cold, Jon led a small band, Ghost pacing silently at his flank, eyes glowing a savage red in the night. With him came Arya, Theon Greyjoy, who had pledged again his loyalty to House Stark, and a handful of the fiercest warriors the North could muster. They had not told the lords of this mission, not officially. It was better done in secrecy to avoid panic or sabotage. Each step upon the icy ground was a step into a realm of uncertain horror. They arrived at dusk to the clearing, huddled among thick-boughed sentinel trees. The wind howled, dislodging clumps of heavy snow from the branches. Their torchlight flared and faltered, dancing over the ancient barrows in the near distance. Amid the swirling flakes, a figure stood. He wore a cloak of black, though his skin was rimed in an otherworldly paleness. His eyes burned a deep, frosty blue, ancient, intelligent, fixed upon Jon Snow as though regarding some puzzle. Jon's heart hammered in his chest. He'd never been this close to the Night King without an army between them. Instinct urged him to fight. The Night King had raised the dead at Hardhome with a casual lift of his arms. Yet here he was, alone in the swirling snow. Ghost snarled but made no move forward, as though uncertain of this moment that defied all prior experience. The Night King inclined his head in what might have been a parody of greeting or acknowledgement. His posture was not overtly hostile. In the hush, Arya's hand hovered at the hilt of her dagger, the blade forged of Valyrian steel. Theon's breath streamed in icy plumes, each exhalation a question of survival. Jon took a careful step forward. His words emerged rough as stone dragged across ice. "You wanted a parley?" No response came in the ordinary sense. But a faint ripple of power seemed to waft through the air, as though the trees themselves quivered in recognition of an old presence. The Night King extended an open palm. Upon it rested a single shard of dragonglass. Jon recognized it for what it was, the very weapon that could kill White Walkers, the black dagger that once spelled doom for the others. Yet the figure did not brandish it, he offered it out, a gesture of uneasy peace. Somehow in that moment, Jon felt a quiet brush across his consciousness, as though an unspoken language sought to find root in his mind. His breath caught. The swirl of images that besieged him was nearly indescribable, an ancient pact shattered by mortal hands long ago. The forging of the White Walkers by the children of the forest, and the horror that had led to rebellion, then cyclical war. But the images moved forward through time, glimpses of the Great War recently fought. The anguish at losing tens of thousands of whites, at the partial defeat. Then something new. An awareness that the long night truly threatened not only men but all memory of existence in the north, for a far greater terror brewed beyond the known realms of ice. A shape of monstrous proportions wreathed in eternal storm. Jon stumbled, knees nearly buckling under the psychic weight. Arya was at his side in an instant, blade half-drawn. Theon brandished a sword, looking from Jon to the Night King with dread. But Jon raised a hand to halt them, though sweat broke over his brow despite the freezing air. He forced himself to remain upright, to meet that unnatural gaze. In it he sensed something entirely unexpected, the faintest trembling flicker of fear. The Night King was afraid, not of men, not of dragons, but something else. Something he alone had glimpsed in those frozen wastes beyond the known world. A brittle hush followed. The Night King lowered his palm, letting the piece of dragonglass tumble lightly into the snow. Then, turning his head slightly, he motioned for them to follow. Jon hesitated. Arya and Theon exchanged a look. The northern warriors clutched their weapons, uncertain. But Jon felt compelled, certain that there was more to this than a trap. The small band trudged behind the figure for what felt like hours, weaving between the looming shapes of the barrows, each barrow a silent testament to the ancient kings and heroes of the north. At a hollow ring of stones, the Night King raised a single hand. From the darkness emerged a line of whites, once men, some even in tattered black cloaks of the Night's Watch, others in the armor of northern lords or lesser houses. Each moved not with ravenous aggression but with a methodic, unsettling calm. Arya's heart pounded, hand tightening on her Valyrian steel. But the Whites simply stood in a semicircle as if awaiting a command from their cold lord. The Night King seemed to focus on Jon, the azure inferno of his eyes a silent narration of meaning. Jon couldn't read it fully, but he understood a portion of what was being offered, an uneasy alliance. Or at least a truce, contingent on House Stark's assistance in preventing some darker calamity from emerging. Jon's mind reeled. How could they trust such a being? Hadn't the Night King brought death and destruction to innocents across the lands? Yet he recalled the swirl of glimpses, the sense that the White Walkers themselves might have once been guardians gone astray. War, despair, the betrayal of ancient pacts, they had shaped them into an unstoppable foe. But what if necessity forced them now to reconsider their path? That first night was not an agreement but an opening of negotiations. Jon returned to Winterfell with more questions than answers. He told Sansa and the rest of his council of the bizarre meeting. Sansa was pale and furious. Had Jon risked his life for illusions conjured by a being known for relentless slaughter? Daenerys and many of the lords were incensed at the suggestion that House Stark might even entertain working with the Night King. Tyrion, for once, found himself at a loss for words, uncertain whether to counsel caution or scorn. But Davos, kneading his hands, softly asked the question none wanted to face: if the rumors were true of a monstrous threat lurking beyond the lands of Always Winter, some force even the Night King could not contain alone, what hope did men have to stand against it on their own? Before suspicion could tear the fledgling alliances within Winterfell asunder, a second sign arrived. Another single White, carrying a chest of carved runes, approached the outskirts of Winterfell without violence. The watchers on the walls nearly loosed arrows, but Jon ordered them to stand down. The White, ignoring the hail of curses from the ramparts, set the chest upon the snow, then collapsed into a heap of inanimate flesh and bones. Inside the chest was an arrangement of weirwood pieces and black stones carved with the same spiral symbol. There was a mosaic depicting the north, the wall, and the swirling mass of the unknown beyond. Jon, Bran, and Samwell Tarly spent long hours poring over these new clues. Sam's brow furrowed as he unearthed old scrolls in the library that referenced legends from the Dawn Age. There were fleeting mentions of an entity called the Ice Terror, a power even the children of the forest feared, stirring at the polar cap of the world. If those half-lost records were accurate, the Night King's unholy creation might have been a misguided attempt to forge a weapon or guardian to face that bleak force in ages past. A chain of violence and vengeance had overshadowed that original purpose, plunging Westeros into cyclical darkness. All signs pointed to one conclusion: this monstrous presence, once dormant, was slowly awakening. If left unchecked, it could drown the entire continent in a supernatural winter that even the others could not quell alone. Westeros would become a grave for the living, the dead, and all memories of the realm. Night after night, Jon wrestled with his own doubt. He confided in Sansa that if they agreed to any alliance with the Night King, it would sow panic among their own. The mere suggestion would be enough to crack any notion of trust in his kingship. But Sansa also saw the burden on Jon's shoulders. She didn't want him to bear that weight alone. The decision was not simply Jon's, it was for all of House Stark. And House Stark had endured so many tragedies that perhaps they could glimpse a path beyond hatred if it meant saving the realm. Arya insisted on being part of any further negotiations. Theon, seeking redemption for his past betrayals, offered to stand guard at Jon's side. Even Daenerys, though skeptical, recognized that ignoring this possibility could doom them. Slowly, like an avalanche building from a single loose pebble, the unstoppable momentum of necessity compelled them to a momentous choice. The realm was on a precipice. They could either stand with the Night King against this nameless terror or be consumed in a cataclysm that would make the previous war look like a mere skirmish. A second meeting with the Night King was arranged in the same haunted clearing near the Barrow Fields. This time, Daenerys arrived with Drogon circling overhead, the great beast's shadow devouring the moonlight. The Northern Lords had not been told all the details, only that it was crucial for the future of the realm. The Night King appeared as before, emerging from the swirling snow with silent Whites in tow. The Watchers, unsullied, led by Grey Worm, a handful of Stark men, and Arya, clung to their weapons in tense readiness. Jon inhaled sharply as he approached. The Night King's gaze flickered to the black outline of the dragon overhead. Yet there was no immediate aggression. Instead, an uncanny voice, cold as the breath of a glacier, pressed into their minds. It was not speech in any conventional sense, but they felt it. as if the wind itself carried a timbre and intention. Daenerys's eyes widened. She felt something old and unearthly brushing the edges of her consciousness, making her recall the day she lost Viserion to the Night King's icy spear. Yet, in that mental hush, she gleaned no immediate hostility. Bran, standing behind Jon in a simple cloak, let himself slip partially into the Weirwood connection, bridging the silent conversation. For a moment, those around him glimpsed flashes of swirling snow and storms beyond storms, each bleaker than the last. The presence that loomed in the far north was vast, a malignant cold that sapped the very essence of life. Even the White Walkers had no illusions about defeating it alone. Then came the unthinkable. With a slow, deliberate gesture, the Night King knelt. His whites likewise bent in subservience, their movements stiff but unmistakable. Jon's breath caught in his throat. The king in the north stood, hammered by the weight of what he beheld. The enemy of mankind, an immortal entity as old as the darkest legends, bowing before him in a gesture that might be submission, or perhaps an alliance sealed by an ancient logic. Daenerys found herself trembling. She had seen kings, knights, and entire armies bend the knee to her cause. But this was beyond comprehension. Could it be genuine? Or was this being weaving some labyrinthine deception? Slowly, Jon stepped forward. "We will help," he said, voice unsteady. "If you truly stand with us against this ice terror, or whatever name it goes by." A ripple of something like acknowledgement passed through the whites. The Night King rose, turning his gaze to Daenerys, as though questioning her acceptance. She hesitated, then gave a single, resolute nod. She had lost too much to illusions. Yet if this being now sought help, if it was no longer the unstoppable tide but a desperate guardian, ignoring it would be a lethal mistake. Thus, an accord was struck with no formal words. No document could bind the living and the dead, only need and the tenuous understanding of survival at any cost. The next weeks were a disconcerting blur in Winterfell. By day, the living toiled, forging weapons not just of dragonglass but also refining steel with the meager reserves of Valyrian stock. By night, the unquiet dead roamed the outskirts under the Night King's watchful presence. Sentries found themselves looking out from the battlements to see lines of whites marching in organized patterns under the moonlight as though drilling for war. At first, panic threatened to overwhelm the castle. Old men cursed the unnatural arrangement, mothers hid their children, and even the bravest knights felt their stomachs roil at the sight of rotting flesh and hollow eyes. Yet the undead did not attack. Occasionally, a small retinue of them would appear at Winterfell's gates bearing newly carved messages of ice or stone for Jon and Bran to interpret. And gradually an uneasy acceptance set in. The living, for the first time in memory, shared the north with the dead. It was a world turned upside down. Sansa, as Lady of Winterfell, struggled to maintain calm. She soothed lords who demanded explanations, hammered out delicate arrangements for supply lines, and tried to hush the ever-simmering fear. Whispers abounded that House Stark had turned to the black arts, forging pacts with a demon. Others claimed Jon Snow was bewitched. But even the naysayers could not deny that a tide of new horrors was rumored to be on the horizon. If the undead were truly on their side for however long, then that might be the only shield capable of stopping a threat that dwarfed them all. Daenerys faced her own crisis of faith. She had come to the north with armies and dragons, intending to unite the realm against the undead. Now she found herself forced to cooperate with the very entity that had once slain her child, Viserion. At nights she wandered the Godwood, seeking quiet, pressing her hand to the bark of the heart tree as though waiting for an answer that would not come. Oh! Any evening, she found Bran there, seated in his strange stillness, eyes flickering as if half lost in a vision. He told her in an eerie monotone that vengeance might serve her heart in the short term, but if she wanted a legacy of life beyond the war, she must see the larger tapestry. She listened and left unsettled. But she began to speak to the Night King, hesitantly, through the bridging presence of Bran whenever possible. In glimpses, she came to understand that not all White Walkers shared the same level of consciousness or power. The Night King was their progenitor, their leader, and in some twisted sense, their caretaker. He had once been something else, a man, perhaps, though that origin was veiled in layers of myth. Over centuries, his purpose had calcified into a quest for dominance over the living, shaped by betrayals old as the first long night. But now that a greater terror stirred, that singular drive had cracked. Self-preservation, if nothing else, demanded a truce. Jon was not idle. While half the realm reeled at the alliance, he took counsel with the lords still loyal to the crown in the north, explaining, without revealing all details, that a new invasion from the far north threatened the entire continent. The lords were frightened, reluctant, but had seen enough horrors to trust Jon's warnings. House Glover, House Manderley, House Serwyn, and the Knights of the Vale who had once answered Sansa's call, none relished facing the unimaginable. Yet they rallied behind their king, battered by the memory of the last war, determined to stand. Winterfell's walls reverberated daily with the ring of hammers on anvils. Blacksmiths, including Gendry, now recognized as Robert Baratheon's bastard son, labored tirelessly to shape new weapons from Dragoglass mined at Dragonstone and from caches discovered near Eastwatch. Even Qyburn, exiled from King's Landing after Cersei's defeat, had found a place in Winterfell's uneasy alliance, his cunning mind bent toward forging catapults that could hurl casks of wildfire. When the first small wave of undead beasts, feral, monstrous creatures more savage than whites, began to appear on the fringes of the north, it confirmed the warnings. These were not commanded by the Night King, they were harbingers of the Ice Terror's imminent approach. Hideous, wolf-like abominations with talons of frost prowled at night, slaughtering travelers and leaving behind corpses twisted by unnatural cold. Some said they were the vanguard of the greater menace. The Night King's own whites drove them off or destroyed them when encountered, indicating a clash between the old powers of the White Walkers and this new threat. As news of these encounters spread, more northern houses hardened their resolve, forging pacts under the banner of the Starks. Jaime Lannister, who had lived to see Cersei's downfall, remained in Winterfell with Brienne of Tarth, both deeply uneasy at the presence of the Night King's forces. Yet they recognized that the forging of an alliance with the dead might be the only barrier between life and a doom beyond comprehension. Ser Brienne, unwavering in her devotion to a promise, turned her energies to training new recruits, men and women alike, for the conflict to come. Tension simmered. Even with a common cause, the living and the dead were oil and water. Brawls broke out in Winter Town when some drunken soldiers confronted a quiet line of whites conducting some unknown task. They hacked apart several of the undead only to watch in horror as the remains reassembled under the flick of an unseen command. The next day, those same soldiers were found with limbs frozen in place as though a glacial chill had crept under their skin. The Night King's warning had been delivered, do not provoke the dead. Jon, furious, had to quell the panic with the help of his closest companions. Slowly, the strange discipline of the undead found a grudging respect. Whites never ate, never slept, never complained. They carried loads from dawn until dusk. Indeed, the concepts of dawn and dusk no longer mattered to them. Under the Night King's direction, they carved fortifications of ice, strengthening Winterfell's perimeter. One morning, the living awoke to find that a wall of frozen spikes had been erected around the main gate, manned by silent, tireless guardians. The living soldiers eyed them warily, but no violence erupted. Bran's visions grew more urgent by the day. He often retreated to the Godwood, merging his mind with ravens that flew far into the frozen north. In scattered glimpses, he saw an advancing gloom, a storm that devoured the horizon. Something gargantuan loomed in the heart of that storm, hard to describe, more shape than form, a presence of devouring frost. Everywhere it passed, the land turned to a blank expanse of unbroken ice. White Walkers, normally masters of the cold, seemed dwarfed in its presence. Bran caught sight of spectral shapes swirling around this entity, each twisted in agony. If the Night King had once threatened humanity, this force threatened all existence. Word spread south, carried by ravens, urging lords from the Reach and the Riverlands to send what men they could. Even King's Landing, under a provisional council now that Cersei was gone and the Iron Throne a matter of unresolved inheritance, stirred with rumors. The few who survived the fiasco of the last war and held influence recognized the dire stakes. Edmure Tully rallied the Riverlands. Gendry was named Lord Baratheon of Storm's End, though that seat was near ruined, and he tried to dispatch men north, though few answered from that battered region. In the Vale, Lord Robin Arryn was persuaded by Sansa through a flurry of ravens of the existential threat, leading to a modest force being sent forth. The new Prince of Dorne also weighed the grim rumors, but the deserts had not forgiven the North for historical rifts, nor had they engaged in the war for the Dawn. Still, a small token envoy arrived, uncertain if these northern tales were exaggerations. The days shortened even more as the dead of winter took hold. Snow blanketed the world. Even the snows around Winterfell seemed deeper and colder than ever before. Supplies ran thin. The living gave up warm bread and salted fish to feed the battered armies that trickled in. Tormund Giantsbane arrived with what remained of the free folk, battered from skirmishes with unnatural creatures north of the wall. For the first time, Tormund found himself side by side with the same wights he once feared, both allied in the name of survival. He clapped Jon on the back, grinning fiercely, though there was no mirth in his eyes. "Never thought I'd fight alongside corpses. But it beats being eaten by whatever that thing is, eh?" Jon managed a tight laugh, but the weight of leadership pressed heavy upon him. He found a strange confidant in the Night King himself. Though they could not speak as men do, Jon felt a resonance when he stood near that unholy creature. Perhaps it was the strange bond of resurrection. Jon had been brought back by the Lord of Light, while the Night King was an embodiment of Ice's darkest power. Or perhaps it was simply the knowledge that both had been shaped by forces beyond their choosing. In their silent standoffs, Jon sometimes gleaned fleeting insights into the Night King's sorrow, as though centuries of conflict and hatred had locked him in a role he could not escape. Every day, preparations accelerated. Ranks of living soldiers now drilled beside ranks of the dead. The living coughed and shivered in the freezing air while the wights stood as immovable as statues. Archers practiced with dragonglass-tipped arrows. Catapults were tested under Qyburn's direction, loaded with wild concoctions meant to ignite the frozen hide of monstrous beasts. Even Tyrion tried to shape some measure of strategy from the chaos, forging a plan that would place the unstoppable tide of wights at strategic points around the fortress. Jaime and Brienne trained cavalry units, though the ground was so icy that horses often slipped. The plan, in broad strokes, was simple: hold the line at Winterfell, for nowhere further south was as defensible. All the while, Daenerys paced, her two dragons, Drogon and Rhaegal, restless in the chilling winds that seemed to intensify daily as though heralding a cataclysmic arrival. At last, the scouts brought dire news. They glimpsed the storm on the horizon. An endless black cloud, roiling with a savage wind that snuffed out torches and froze limbs in minutes. Wights under the Night King's command formed up in neat lines, a grotesque parody of an army. The living braced themselves along the walls. An uncanny hush fell on Winterfell. Even the rustling of the trees in the godwood seemed still, as though nature itself paused to witness the final confrontation. Then it came, a rising shriek in the night sky, the blizzard rolling in faster than any natural storm. Lightning flickered in jagged forks across the clouds, revealing shapes that defied reason. Towering figures, half-glimpsed silhouettes of ice and swirling shadow, moved at the edges of sight. The temperature dropped so violently that even the wights slowed, their joints encrusted with hoarfrost. Men shivered uncontrollably, breath freezing on their lips. An otherworldly roar echoed off the walls of Winterfell, shaking snow from the battlements. From atop the ramparts, Jon exchanged a grim look with Daenerys and the others. There was no more to do but fight. Ghost snarled beside him, hackles raised. Arya, perched like a silent shadow, tested the grip on her dragonglass blade. Sam Tarly, trembling, clutched a bundle of scrolls, though no last-minute revelation would save them now. Sansa stood on the rampart next to Brienne, her face pale but determined, the memory of her father's courage burning in her heart. Theon guarded Bran in the godwood as they expected the conflict to breach every corner of the castle. With a motion from the Night King, the undead lines began their march. It was a sight that would have frozen the blood of any mortal army. Thousands of wights moved in uncanny unison, directed by a single will. They marched not to tear down Winterfell but to form a barrier around it, as though fortifying the living behind a shield of the dead. Their enemy was not a man-made host but the primal force lurking in that roiling black storm. Lightning flashed again, revealing the monstrous abominations. Some had the silhouette of great ice spiders, scuttling forward with impossible speed, shrieking in twisted echoes. Others resembled giant ice serpents, sinuous forms that carved furrows in the snow. And behind them all loomed the ephemeral shape of something bigger, overshadowing the horizon, a half-formed titan of swirling frost and darkness, its body a living hurricane. Tendrils of freezing mist lashed out, turning the ground to black ice wherever they landed. A hideous screech echoed across the plain. The first wave of monstrous creatures slammed into the white lines. Fleshless claws met rotting limbs in an unnatural dance of predator and prey. Shards of ice flew through the air, slicing apart ranks of the dead. Yet the wights fought without fear, piling upon the creatures in wave after wave, their weapons striking with the unstoppable drive of an unfeeling host. When the monstrous ice spiders tore into the undead, that same moment allowed another rank of wights to swarm onto the creatures' backs, hacking away with dragonglass weapons. From the battlements, living archers loosed volley after volley of dragonglass arrows. Many soared wide in the screaming wind, but some found their mark, shattering ice flesh and dissolving lesser terrors into frozen shards. The entire battlefield churned with swirling snow, shrieks, and the clashing of unnatural forces. Then came a thunderous, bone-rattling roar. The swirl of the storm parted like a curtain, revealing that looming shape. Many men faltered in terror, scarcely able to comprehend the enormity of it. It was as if a glacier had grown limbs of living cold, towered over the battlefield, and stared down at Winterfell with malevolent, ancient eyes of shimmering frost. Each footstep it took shook the ground. The walls of Winterfell trembled as if in an earthquake. The Night King stepped forward atop the battlement, raising an arm in challenge. Even from a distance, the watchers could feel the clash of supernatural wills. The monstrous entity, call it the Ice Terror, the primal beast of winter's heart, sent a surge of freezing wind that tore at the ramparts, ripping banners from their poles. Stone cracked under the assault. Men tumbled, their screams lost in the cacophony. Daenerys, staggering to keep her footing, caught Jon's eye. He nodded, jaw set. It's time. They rushed to where Drogon and Rhaegal were stationed, each dragon roaring in agitation at the overwhelming cold. Daenerys mounted Drogon, Jon took Rhaegal, and with a savage cry they launched into the turbulent sky. Instantly, the wind battered them, threatening to throw them off their mounts. Below, the whites and monstrous beings continued a frenzied battle. The dragons soared higher, struggling to find purchase in the swirling gloom. Suddenly, a shape broke through the clouds. A winged horror of ice, a twisted reflection of a dragon. The watchers below realized with horror that the Ice Terror had conjured or summoned its own airborne monstrosity, a draconic shape of living frost. It crashed into Drogon, snarling with a voice like crashing glaciers. Drogon roared in fury, unleashing a jet of flames that sputtered in the unnatural chill, only partially engulfing the ice dragon's flank. Rhaegal dove at the beast from the side, claws raking across frozen scales that resisted the blow but cracked in places. In the Godswood, Bran's eyes rolled back. He warged into a flock of ravens that soared overhead, trying to coordinate the dragon's assault. Through that vantage, he guided them to strike in tandem, driving the ice dragon toward the ground. Yet even as they harried it, the monstrous titan of the storm loomed, a swirling vortex of dark frost that lashed out with tendrils of black ice. It smashed into Rhaegal, sending the dragon spinning out of the sky. Jon held fast, face contorting in pain as Rhaegal roared in distress, slamming into the ground near the walls. Soldiers scattered. Daenerys' heart clenched, but she could not break off. She urged Drogon into a dive, flames tearing through the bitter wind, scorching a path toward the Titan's center mass. The monstrous figure recoiled, letting out a roar that shook the heavens. For an instant it seemed the flames might carve a path, but then an unholy wind snuffed them out. Ice coated Drogon's wings, and the great beast bellowed, fighting to stay aloft. At that moment, the Night King appeared on the battlefield, walking with measured steps through the carnage. Whites parted to make way. Bits of burning debris and swirling ice battered his form, but he did not falter. He raised both arms, and a sudden wave of necromantic energy rippled out. Hundreds of fallen whites lurched back to their feet, limbs reassembling, forming fresh ranks to assault the monstrous horde. But that would not be enough. Jon, regaining his bearings after dismounting Rhaegal, saw the unstoppable mass of the Titan towering above. If they didn't pierce its core, nothing would remain of Winterfell. Ghost dashed by Jon's side, snarling at the chaos. Theon and a group of Ironborn tried to hold one side of the courtyard where smaller ice monstrosities broke through. Arya flitted like a silent reaper among them, her Valyrian steel dagger finding every weak spot. She left a trail of shattered ice limbs in her wake, each kill a testament to the skill she'd honed across years of hardship. Jon fought his way back to Rhaegal, helping the wounded dragon rise. The beast shook off shards of ice, letting out a pained roar. Together, they took to the sky again. Jon guided Rhaegal to circle behind the Titan, hoping to exploit an opening. Daenerys, controlling Drogon, pressed the monstrous entity from the front with blasts of flame. Each time the Titan reeled, but it refused to succumb, its colossal form regenerating ice where flame had melted it. Time stretched into a nightmarish swirl of roaring winds, swirling white, and the screams of men and beasts. The living lines faltered in places, forcing the undead ranks to shift and reinforce them. The synergy was terrible to behold, men fighting alongside whites, covering each other's weaknesses, guided by the macabre intelligence of the Night King. On any other day, it would have been a betrayal of all that was natural. But here, survival demanded unthinkable alliances. Bran, still warding, reached out with his power, using the Heart Tree as a conduit, channeling the ancient energy of the Children of the Forest. He sought to contain the Titan's power, weaving illusions of the old magic that might hamper its sense of direction. For flickering moments, the Titan stumbled, turning its massive head as if disoriented, offering an opening. Jon seized that chance, urging Rhaegal into a steep dive. Valyrian steel in hand, he aimed for the Titan's massive core, a vortex of swirling ice and black wind at the center of its chest. Daenerys, seeing his intent, drove Drogon's flame to envelop that exact spot, softening it. The Titan bellowed, thrashing. Great shards of ice whipped out, one striking Drogon's flank, making the dragon roar in agony. Blood rained onto the battlefield. But the gap in the Titan's chest widened for one critical second. Jon leapt from Rhaegal's saddle, plunging downward with Longclaw raised. He landed against the Titan's shifting surface, boots scrabbling for purchase on slick ice. Desperately, he shoved Longclaw, a sword forged of Valyrian steel, into the Titan's core. Frost crackled up his arm, biting his flesh through layers of leather. But he drove deeper, roaring in defiance, forcing the sword through swirling storms of malevolence. Light flared from within, a clash of steel and primordial ice that shattered the air in an explosion of unnatural thunder. The Titan howled an ear-splitting screech that threatened to rend the souls of all who heard it. A massive shockwave erupted, hurling wights, men, and the monstrous creatures alike across the field. Jon lost his grip on Longclaw, feeling the blade twist inside the Titan's chest. The freezing wind nearly tore him apart, but in that instant of cataclysm, a different presence joined his cause. The Night King stood below, arms raised, channeling his own cosmic cold to battle the Titan's primal force from within. Between Jon's Valyrian steel and the Night King's mastery of the dead, the Titan's giant shape cracked like glass, huge fissures of bright white crossing its form. With one final roar, it disintegrated into a blizzard of fragments, scattering across the battlefield in an avalanche of ice. For a moment, it felt as if the entire north stood still, no sound but the howling wind. Jon slammed into the ground, air driven from his lungs. Ghost appeared at his side moments later, whining and nudging him. Jon's vision blurred. He saw a swirl of movement overhead, Daenerys guiding Drogon to land, battered but alive. The whites continued to clash with the smaller horrors, but the Titan's death sent shockwaves of discord through the enemy ranks. Many of the monstrous creatures froze in place or shattered altogether. The wind began to calm, the black clouds overhead thinning. The unstoppable storm receded as though the seat of its power had been destroyed. Winterfell stood battered and broken in places, towers collapsed, walls fractured. Fires burned in scattered pockets where fire casks had ignited or dragon flame had scorched the ramparts. Bodies lay everywhere, men and women of the north, unsullied, free folk, and the dead. Among them, countless undead had been torn apart by the unstoppable fury of the monstrous invasion. But the north still stood. Through ringing ears, Jon heard a cheer rise from the living. Relief crashed upon him like a wave. He coughed raggedly, tasting blood. Sansa and Arya sprinted across the courtyard to reach him, tears blending with the snow that fell. Tyrion and Davos emerged from behind a collapsed portion of the wall, both wounded but alive, faces etched with awe at their survival. Tormund, soaked in blood, exhaled a shaky laugh, raising a battered axe. All eyes then turned to the Night King. He stood amid the field of carnage, the swirling frost around him settling. He had commanded the dead to victory, had lent his power to Jon's decisive blow. Now he regarded the broken battlefield with hollow eyes, the flicker of that ancient enmity still burning in their depths. For a tense moment, the living braced, uncertain if he might revert to his old purpose, that of annihilating all mortal life. Jon forced himself to his feet with help from Sansa. He looked at the Night King across the distance. The silence stretched. From the ragged lines of men came the hush of 100 hearts pounding. One could almost hear the gentle crackle of settling ice. Then, with slow, deliberate finality, the Night King lowered his arms. His gaze flicked to Jon, then to the battered ranks of the living. For a breath, they saw something in that inhuman face, resignation, or perhaps acceptance. The creature that had been the apex of terror for so long seemed to understand that its reason for war had ended. There was no sign of triumph, only the weight of centuries. Without a word, he inclined his head to Jon Snow, a gesture reminiscent of that bizarre parley. Moments later, the Night King turned. His whites began to gather, those that had not been destroyed or scattered. Slowly, they formed a silent procession across the battered grounds, moving outward beyond the collapsed gates of Winterfell. It was as though some silent command had recalled them. The living parted for them, some in awe, some in revulsion, no one daring to provoke a final confrontation. The unnatural host marched north, back into the ice and darkness from whence they came, leaving behind a realm that had, for the briefest time, become their ally. In their wake, the pale glow of an overcast dawn spread across Winterfell. Bodies of men and women who had fallen in the battle were now truly at rest, their remains not reanimated. The threat that once loomed over all life had marched away, perhaps forever, or perhaps merely until the cyclical nature of old powers brought a new crisis. Jon dropped to his knees, burying his face in the snow, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had transpired. Sansa and Arya knelt beside him, each placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Daenerys dismounted Drogon, staggering, leaning on Tyrion for support, while Grey Worm led surviving Unsullied to methodically secure the courtyard. They had done the unthinkable, allied with the Night King and his legions to defeat a horror greater still. The cost was immeasurable. Scores of good men and women lay dead or maimed. The North would spend generations recovering if it could at all. But they had survived. Westeros had a chance to breathe again. That evening, as pyres were lit for the countless fallen, the sky bore a strange, shimmering aurora of pale blues and greens, a final echo of the unleashed magic. Jon stood beside Daenerys and Sansa by the highest pyre, which contained the bodies of many who had fought to protect Winterfell. They watched the flames climb, devouring the wood, sending sparks dancing into the twilight. A funeral hush gripped the remains of the armies. Free folk, Northerners, Unsullied, Knights of the Vale, and foreign allies alike stood shoulder to shoulder. The old boundaries of region and fealty momentarily dissolved in shared mourning. Gendry said a quiet prayer to the Seven, Tormund offered a wildling farewell, Arya's eyes glistened though she held them firm, and Tyrion poured wine onto the snow in silent tribute. In the days that followed, the battered realm tried to piece itself together once more. Some men returned south with stories that would become legend, how House Stark, the living, and the dead joined forces to save Westeros. Many refused to believe such tales. They were whispered in taverns and told as bedtime stories to wide-eyed children, the day the dreaded Night King knelt, not to subjugate but to stand alongside the living against a terror older than memory. In time, the snows began to recede from the immediate grounds around Winterfell as though nature itself recognized that the worst had passed. Yet no one forgot the cost. Jon Snow found little solace in the victory. Each morning, he walked the walls of Winterfell, staring north, his breath steaming in the cold. He would close his eyes and remember that moment of unity, horrific and wondrous, when mortal men and the White Walkers fought side by side. He wondered what new shape the North would take in the centuries ahead, haunted by the knowledge that such alliances might be needed again. Daenerys hovered by the yard where Drogon and Rhaegal rested, nursing their wounds. Though she had lost one dragon in the earlier war, the two remaining had survived. She saw to their care with a devotion reminiscent of a mother cradling her children. Under her watch, the dragons soared again above the north, reminders that while the cold might claim dominion, the heat of life still burned. Sansa took up her role as Lady of Winterfell with renewed purpose. She oversaw the distribution of food and resources, ensuring that the lords who had answered the call were cared for. She skillfully navigated the politics that would shape the realm's future. Many lords swore fealty anew to the king in the north, acknowledging a debt they could never repay. Some even recanted their earlier suspicions, though not all. Rumors of dark arts lingered in corners of the realm, seeds of future distrust that no victory could fully uproot. Bran Stark, the three-eyed raven, spoke little of what he had seen in the beyond. Occasionally, he would mention in passing that the cycle was broken, at least for now, that some fragment of the Night King's ancient curse had dissolved when the Titan of the Storm was destroyed. But as to the future, he offered only riddles. The threads are tangled in the weirwood's roots. We endure. The rest is to be seen. Arya, restless and haunted by all she had witnessed, took to solitary rides across the north, accompanied only by Ghost at times. She carried her Valyrian dagger, scanning the horizon for new threats, uncertain whether she could ever truly settle into a life of peace. Yet the freedom of the open expanse reminded her of her journeys in the past. She had outgrown being a frightened girl, and she was not quite the faceless assassin anymore. She was something else, shaped by the fires and frosts of war. To the far north, beyond the remains of the wall, rumors persisted of wandering whites who no longer had a master and therefore roamed aimless, awaiting some new command. The free folk tried to drive them off, uneasy that traces of the undead might linger for generations. But the main host, led by the Night King, had vanished into the lands of always winter, as if retreating to the far edges of memory. No ravens brought news of them. No visions revealed their fate. It was as though the pact had concluded, and the forces of death returned to the shadows from whence they came. In the aftermath, a council convened at Winterfell, where Tyrion argued that the realm needed a stable monarchy to unify behind the victory. Daenerys claimed that the North had shown its worth, but she still harbored ambitions to reshape Westeros in a more just image. Jon, exhausted by the burdens, refused any talk of the Iron Throne, insisting that House Stark would guard the North and let the rest govern themselves if they so chose. Sansa's voice, calm and clear, guided the discussion. In the end, it was decided that the North would remain an independent kingdom, with Jon Snow as its king, much to his quiet reluctance and acceptance. Daenerys was recognized as queen in the South, though the exact shape of her domain would need further negotiation. For the time being, the realm had bled enough. And so, with the ghosts of the greatest battle in living memory still drifting through broken courtyards and wind-swept ramparts, the North began a slow, halting recovery. Fragments of the alliance with the Night King lingered in the stories shared around hearth fires. Some bards sang it as a heroic epic, while others cast it as a frightening cautionary tale of meddling with forces beyond mortal ken. Yet among House Stark, the memory was more intimate and quietly transformative. They had seen that even the darkest being, crafted for war, shaped by betrayal, could choose a different path when necessity demanded. They had felt the hush of a battlefield shared by living and dead, a brief moment in which eons of conflict were suspended. It was a sliver of hope that, despite all the tragedy and bloodshed, there existed a capacity for unity beyond understanding. On the anniversary of the battle's end, a small group gathered in Winterfell's Godswood at twilight. Jon, Sansa, Arya, Bran, and Daenerys stood around the heart tree, each lost in their own thoughts. Ghosts prowled the perimeter, sniffing at the quiet air. Bran's eyes were distant as though recalling echoes of that titanic clash. Sansa touched the weirwood trunk, feeling the old bark ridges under her fingertips, drawing a sense of peace. Arya knelt, trailing a finger along a carved sigil on one of the roots, thinking of the countless souls lost. Daenerys stood a little apart, gazing up at the pale moon shining through the canopy of red leaves. Her expression was one of guarded hope. She had fought so many wars, lost so many she loved, and yet here she was, breathing air that might have been filled with the stench of endless corpses had this alliance never occurred. A swirl of emotions crossed her features, relief, sorrow, a faint flicker of gratitude for the impossible chance that had turned enemies into temporary allies. Jon, taking a slow breath, cleared his throat. We owe a debt to those who fell, and we owe a debt to an enemy who chose to stand with us. The admission felt raw on his tongue, for the Night King had been the embodiment of nightmare for so long. Yet the truth would not be denied. Sansa nodded, stroking a fallen leaf. The cost was immeasurable, but we are here. House Stark endures. The North endures. Bran's voice was soft, almost absent. And time moves on. The wheel of seasons will turn again, spring will come, then winter once more. But the memory of this day will echo in the weirwood's song for as long as the trees stand. Arya rose to her feet, fists clenched as if wrestling with the tension inside her. We did what we had to do. I just never thought I'd see that. The Night King fighting by our side. Daenerys stepped closer, drawing in the hush of the Godwood. We saw many impossible things in our lives. Dragons reborn, the dead walking, a Targaryen uniting with a Stark. She allowed herself a small, sad smile. Maybe it's time we learned that what we believe impossible can sometimes become our only salvation. Jon met her gaze, and for the first time in days, something like peace settled upon him. He remembered the shattering spectacle of that final strike, how the Night King had been at his side in that crucial moment. Could such a monstrous being truly possess the capacity for more than destruction? Perhaps in that one fleeting instance, the Night King had glimpsed a different purpose or reclaimed some primal vow that had been twisted over the ages. With the ceremonies of remembrance concluded, the small group parted in the Godwood, returning to their obligations. Yet none forgot that night, that union forged in desperation. The North would always bear scars etched into every stone of Winterfell. In taverns across Westeros, the name of the Night King would remain a byword for terror. But among those who fought that final battle, a hush of reverence accompanied the tales. They had stood beside a living legend of horror, forging a shield that saved the realm from annihilation. In the months that followed, reconstruction progressed slowly. New trade routes opened from the Vale and the Riverlands, bringing lumber and stone. The farmers planted again in the fields, determined to coax life from the frozen ground. Daenerys eventually flew south to attend to the complexities of her newly claimed throne, leaving enough unsullied and advisors behind to maintain a friendly alliance with the North. Winterfell was no longer just the seat of House Stark, it was a symbol of the day when ice and fire, living and dead, had set aside hatred long enough to avert an apocalypse. Jon, for his part, ruled as he always had, reluctantly, with sincerity and a heavy heart. The northern lords watched him warily at first, still coming to terms with a king who had treated with the Night King. Yet they recognized his sacrifices. They acknowledged that none else could have navigated that impossible path and led them out the other side. Over time, respect deepened into a loyalty that would define a new era of the North's history. And so the realm carried on as realms do. Ravens flew with tidings of births, deaths, marriages, and alliances. Crops rose and fell. Generations would pass, layering fresh joys and sorrows upon the old. Some would dismiss the story of the Night King's alliance as mere fancy. Others would embroider it into epic poems, complete with exaggerated duels in swirling blizzards and dragons scorching entire armies of ice. A few, especially the children born during or after that cataclysmic night, would listen wide-eyed, hearts pounding at the realization that sometimes the greatest enemy can become, for a moment, a necessary friend. Yet in quiet corners of Winterfell, the truth remained. In that swirling vortex of a final battle, something profound had shifted. If one listened closely on cold, moonlit nights, standing near the walls that once shook under the Titan's roar, they might feel an echo of the unimaginable synergy that briefly bridged the chasm between life and death. A single spark of possibility that in even the darkest winter, alliances can forge a dawn. Jon Snow felt it now and then as he stood by the battlements looking to the horizon. Perhaps the Night King had been an adversary shaped by eons of hatred, but in the end, they had fought together to save Westeros from a doom even darker. That knowledge weighed heavily on Jon's soul, but it also granted him a strange, stoic comfort, a lesson that the lines between friend and foe can blur when the world itself teeters on the brink. There were nights when Jon dreamed of that battle. In his dreams, he stood shoulder to shoulder with the Night King in a vast plain of swirling snow. They did not speak, for there was no language that bridged their divide. But they both raised swords of ice and steel, driving them into the heart of a great darkness. Then the dream ended, leaving him with a solitary feeling of awe and dread. He would awaken to the quiet of his bedchamber, hearing the faint whistling of wind through the arrow slits. In such moments, he wondered if the Night King still roamed the far north, searching the horizon for new threats. Or if he, too, dreamed of the day he knelt by men who had once been his mortal enemies. Perhaps that was the only immortality possible, the knowledge that for one breath in the world's long story, the living and the dead had found something like kinship. The memory of that alliance faded into the tapestry of Westeros's countless sagas, overshadowed by new conflicts or new reigns. Yet House Stark would never forget. Their words, "Winter is coming," carried a deeper resonance now. Winter had come. Winter had all but swallowed them. And in that darkest hour, they had found, in the strangest of places, a hand outstretched to join theirs against an even greater winter. So, in the end, the North stood battered but unbroken. The living walked among the ruins with hearts ablaze with the gift of a new dawn. The dead returned to the silence of ice and darkness, their king leading them back to an ancient realm beyond mortal sight. And between them lay the memory of a single battle that redefined possibility. House Stark did not sing triumphantly of it, nor did they curse it in bitterness. They remembered in silence, their hearts heavier and wiser, knowing that sometimes even the darkest shadows can be guided, for a moment, to fight for the light. And in that hush, as the snows finally began to melt and the first buds of a shy northern spring peeked through the frost, one might say the greatest secret gift was hope. A fragile thread, woven in the face of utter despair, that one day the cycles of hatred and terror could be broken, not by the vanquishing of evil alone, but by the forging of an alliance where no alliance should ever have been possible. That was what if the Night King joined forces with House Stark. And that was how, against every doom-laden prophecy, the North and all Westeros survived. Time drifted forward like a slow tide, carrying Westeros into a fragile new era. Winter had not yet abandoned the North, heavy snow still blanketed the roads, turning travel into a trial of endurance. But the cataclysmic storm that once threatened to erase every living soul had dispersed. The air remained cold, the wind sharp. Yet there was an unmistakable undercurrent of relief. Fires burned in Winterfell's hearths day and night, celebrating a survival that felt equal parts miracle and uneasy bargain. Jon Snow, king in the North, spent his waking hours tangled in 100 mundane problems that felt both trivial and monumental after the horrors of the long night. He walked the walls each morning at dawn, boots crunching on frost-rimed stone. The watchmen saluted him, but a hushed respect had replaced the boisterous camaraderie of earlier days. Many of these men had marched in the final battle, had witnessed the Night King defend Winterfell from the monstrous titan of frost that loomed out of the far north. Such memories left them somber and reflective. They had not simply witnessed the near end of the world. They had fought beside the being who once personified their worst nightmares. Jon often paused on the ramparts to gaze northward, where the sky was a soft wash of gray over endless snowfields. It was impossible not to think of the Night King, of that silent host that had withdrawn back beyond the boundaries of men. Even after all that had transpired, Jon felt no certainty of what truly lived within that icy consciousness. Had the Night King's moment of alliance been purely a matter of survival? Or had some deeper shift taken place in that timeless entity's purpose? The questions circled endlessly in Jon's mind. No matter how he examined them, he found no neat answer. Duty pressed him on. The living still needed a king, a steward, someone to see them through the aftermath. His right shoulder still ached where frost had penetrated his flesh in the final assault on the Titan. Even Maester Wolkan's treatments, salves reeking of pungent herbs, could not entirely dispel the lingering numbness. A small price to pay, Jon thought grimly, for a realm that still breathed. Ghost accompanied him on these wall-top walks, ever the silent, watchful companion with fur the color of fresh fallen snow and eyes that gleamed red in the half-light. Sometimes Ghost would lift his muzzle and sniff the wind as though searching for a presence both familiar and alien. But he never growled or bristled, and Jon took that as a subtle sign that the danger had receded, at least for now. Winterfell's courtyard was a bustle of controlled chaos. Smiths clanged away at their forges to shape new weapons, fix battered armor, or repurpose shattered shields. Wagons laden with provisions rolled in from the few southern territories that had begun to re-establish trade routes, a boon orchestrated by Sansa Stark's tireless negotiations. Soldiers trained in the yard, younger recruits learning the fundamentals of swordplay, some still bearing bruises or scars from the recent war. The training master barked orders in a voice worn thin by shouting, reminding them that life could not slip back into complacency simply because the immediate threat had passed. In the Great Hall, Sansa presided over the daily administrative tasks, resolving disputes over land, ensuring that the lords who had lost kin in the battle received just recompense, and above all else, rationing food until the next harvest might promise more. She radiated a steady authority. Once she had been a frightened girl dreaming of songs and chivalry. Now she wore Winterfell's weight on her shoulders with quiet grace. The northern lords respected her, and even those from other regions, still uncertain of the new arrangement between north and south, listened when she spoke. In the library, Samwell Tarly pored over old parchments and half-burned tomes compiling the story of the war against the Titan of the far north. He captured the alliance between House Stark and the Night King in carefully chosen words. Though Sam tried his best to be thorough, he knew many would doubt his account. Some pages he left intentionally vague, worried that too many specifics might one day lead to renewed suspicion of dark powers. Yet he believed in preserving the knowledge for future generations should another impossible horror arise. Bran Stark remained a mystery to all but a small circle. Many who saw him rolling through Winterfell's halls in his wheeled chair perceived a calm, distant boy. But those who knew the deeper truth understood that Bran, as the three-eyed raven, saw the realm in ways no mortal could comprehend. He had told Jon in private that the Night King's departure was not a final farewell, rather a withdrawal, as if returning to a primordial slumber. All wheels keep turning, Bran had murmured, his eyes far away. When the time is right, forces once banished can stir again. That warning weighed on Jon's soul. Arya Stark came and went, restless as a hawk. The final battle had tempered her lethal skill with a kind of introspection. She had taken lives many times, Lannister guards, Freys, Whites, and monstrous beasts conjured by the Titan's power. Now she found herself seeking a new role. She lingered in Winterfell to help train a small group of scouts in stealth and self-defense. But at intervals she vanished for days on her horse, riding with Ghost or sometimes alone, exploring the north or venturing into the Riverlands without explanation. She always returned with that quiet sense of distance in her eyes, as though her journey's purpose lay somewhere between self-discovery and vigilance. Daenerys Targaryen tried to settle in the south, where she had traveled to shape her queenly domain, but her heart remained tied to the north by the memory of that final confrontation. She visited Winterfell whenever she could, her dragons circling overhead. Though she had once been the embodiment of fire and fury, now she, too, bore scars of frost. Drogon's flank remained mottled with patches of grayish scar tissue where the Titan's ice had burned away his scales. Rhaegal had healed from his crash landing, though he still flew with a slight hitch in one wing beat. Daenerys's bond with Jon endured, though it shifted from the heat of immediate love into a quiet, deep understanding, two sovereigns bound by shared trauma and a mission to keep Westeros safe from any new darkness. All the while, rumors trickled in from travelers or rangers who ventured north of the Wall. Strange sightings of whites wandering aimlessly, ignoring mortal beings unless provoked. Snowdrifts that seemed to move of their own accord, unveiling glimpses of ghostly shapes. A few free folk claimed to have seen the Night King at a distance, drifting across a frozen plateau under eerie moonlight, his whites trailing behind him in silent formation. Jon kept these stories close to his chest, not wishing to alarm the realm any more than it already was. Seasons in Westeros seldom followed a predictable cycle, but a subtle shift emerged in the months after the Great Battle. Though the cold lingered, there came a day when the snows began to melt around Winterfell's walls. Trickles of water ran in narrow rivulets down the cobblestone paths. New buds, tentative but determined, sprouted in the godwood. The shift was so slight that many barely noticed, but for the Starks, who had grown up heeding that timeless warning of their house, it felt momentous. Winter had come, and in some measure it had begun to recede. With the gradual thaw, more envoys from the southern regions traveled to Winterfell, spurred by curiosity and uncertain alliances. Lord Yohn Royce from the Vale brought grain wagons, accompanied by a large retinue of knights. He and Sansa negotiated a trade agreement over a long table strewn with parchment. Lady Brienne of Tarth, who had stayed behind to ensure stability, acted as a shield between disagreements, bridging tensions when southern lordlings questioned the presence of northern magic or rumors of dark pacts. At each mention of the Night King's alliance, Sansa's face remained inscrutable. She neither confirmed nor denied the details. What the North had done was known to those who needed to know. Others could gossip and spin tall tales to their heart's content. Despite the hustle of reconstruction, tensions simmered in the background. Some lords whispered that Jon Snow was no true Stark, that his father's name was Targaryen. Others complained that if Daenerys Targaryen had indeed lost the Iron Throne in the chaos of war, who truly reigned in the south? A provisional council led by Tyrion Lannister, Gendry Baratheon, and Davos Seaworth tried to keep order in King's Landing and the Crownlands. Yet the infrastructure was battered. Crops had withered in the long winter. Many nobles squabbled over inheritance, territory, or old wounds. If the realm was not threatened by an undead apocalypse, it still teetered under the weight of mortal failings. Amid these dynamics, Jon often felt a longing for his earlier, simpler life, once a bastard, once a man of the Night's Watch. The throne room in Winterfell felt alien. He tried to keep the rulership humble, no elaborate court, no forced homage. Yet day after day, lines of petitioners came to plead for resources or request judgments on everything from stolen cattle to border disputes with lesser lords. Jon navigated each with steady fairness, relying heavily on Sansa's counsel and, occasionally, Arya's acute sense of deception. He missed the days when his only worry was patrolling the Wall with brothers who, despite their flaws, had been loyal in their own way. Now the burdens of monarchy took their toll. One evening, under the light of a waxing moon, Jon stood in the godwood, staring at the reflection of pale moonbeams in the still pond beneath the heart tree. The bark of the ancient weirwood glowed faintly, and the carved face in its trunk seemed to observe him with knowing eyes. Snow crunched softly behind him. He turned to see Bran approaching, wheeled along by Podrick Payne, who had become a dutiful attendant. Podrick stepped away to give them privacy. Bran gazed at Jon with that uncanny calm. Jon offered a small smile. "You're out late." "Time and I keep different hours," Bran replied, his voice soft but carrying a weight that made Jon shiver. "I've been dreaming again. Or looking." Jon's breath misted in front of him. "Should I be worried? I don't see another threat like the Titan on the horizon. For now, the North breathes freely." Jon exhaled a slow breath of relief. "That's good." Bran's gaze drifted to the heart tree. "The Night King is restless. He's not attacking us. But I feel his presence stirring. Like a distant echo in the weirwood network. He's searching for something." Jon's jaw tensed. "Searching for what?" "I can't be sure. Maybe for a place in the world he no longer understands. Or maybe for the last remnants of the children of the forest. Ancient secrets. Or possibly he's seeking those who were touched by powers akin to his own. Like you, Jon." The king in the north suppressed a shiver. He remembered how the Night King had lifted an army of the dead at Har Home with a single gesture, how he had once relentlessly pursued the living. And then he recalled how that same being had stood side by side with him to destroy the Titan. It was a contradiction that made Jon's head spin. If he's searching for me, it won't be hard to find me here. Bran's eyes glimmered with an otherworldly sheen. He's not ready to cross the boundary between his domain and ours again. But if he ever does, you'll feel it. That strange bond you share is not broken, only quiet. Jon swallowed, uncertain what comfort he could glean from that. He looked at the moonlit pond, the reflection broken by a stray leaf drifting across the surface. We'll remain vigilant. Bran nodded, and for a moment that eerie, ancient stillness enveloped him. Then he blinked, returning to the present, though his voice retained a certain calm. You're doing well, Jon. The North stands, and the memories of the war have not been lost. That's the best we can manage in a world that seldom knows peace. Jon placed a hand on Bran's shoulder. He wondered at his younger brother's composure, the acceptance of so many burdens. But such reflection carried no easy answers. After a moment of shared silence, Podrick returned and wheeled Bran away, leaving Jon once more in the hush of the Godwood. The Hearttree's carved face, with its tears of crimson sap, seemed to stare into him as though measuring the weight of his doubts. Spring continued its slow, stumbling advance across Westeros. The snows retreated from the roads around Winterfell, turning them into muddy streams. New caravans arrived, bearing textiles, wine, spices. Farmers emerged to inspect their fields, uncertain of what seeds had survived the frost. Beyond the castle walls, Wintertown rekindled with commerce. Merchants hawked furs and leathers, foreign traders displayed bright silks, and blacksmiths hammered out nails and horseshoes with renewed vigor. The living world insisted on revival even after the unimaginable. Amid this bustle, Daenerys Targaryen returned again, her arrival heralded by the roar of dragons overhead. She sat down in the training yard, accompanied by a small entourage of Dothraki and Unsullied who remained loyal to her cause. At first, a hush fell, old fears reawakened by the shadow of leathery wings blotting the sun. But when people recognized the silver-haired queen astride Drogon, they offered cautious cheers. She had bled for the North, lost a dragon to the Night King, then fought beside them. Whatever reservations they still held about Targaryens, they could not deny her devotion to saving lives. Jon greeted Daenerys personally in the courtyard, helping her dismount. She removed her riding gloves, revealing hands calloused from clutching the dragon's reins against the wind. They exchanged a quiet smile. No dramatic embrace, no fanfare, eh? Just the mutual understanding of rulers who had gone through the crucible of war together. She spoke softly so only Jon could hear. King's Landing is managing, if barely. Tyrion tries to keep a fractured council in line, but many houses still jockey for power. Some question my authority. Others question whether you should rule the entire continent instead. It's an endless swirl of politics. Jon nodded, guiding her toward the castle. I don't want the Iron Throne. We've settled that. A flicker of wry amusement crossed Daenerys's face. Desire is seldom relevant in politics. You're a war hero and rumored Targaryen. That alone makes certain houses imagine their fortunes would rise if they rally behind you. Meanwhile, some resent me for bringing foreign armies into Westeros. The realm recovers, but old habits die hard. Jon led her up a flight of steps and into a hallway where the chill of the outside gave way to the warmth of torches. Well, let them talk. The North will guard itself. We've enough to worry about without entangling ourselves in southern battles. They entered the solar where Sansa awaited, seated behind a wooden table spread with maps. Candlelight illuminated the dust motes drifting in the air. Arya leaned against the wall, arms folded, and Bran sat nearby, a silent observer. Daenerys inclined her head to Sansa, who returned the gesture politely. Though the two women had forged a tenuous respect, the ghosts of old mistrust lingered in the subtle tension around their eyes. Daenerys unfastened her cloak and spread it over the back of a chair. I'm told rebuilding is going well here. Sansa tapped her fingertips on the map. Well enough. We've managed to salvage farmland and maintain a decent food supply. We're establishing roads to connect some outlying settlements. But we face shortages of coin, trained builders, and supplies. The Vale helps, but we're stretched thin. Daenerys nodded. King's Landing can send more builders once the Red Keep's repairs are finished. We could also arrange shipments of grain from the Reach. Jon settled into a seat beside Sansa. Every resource is appreciated. But there's also the matter of the scattered whites in the far north. Our rangers keep reporting odd sightings. Whatever remains of the Night King's host that wasn't destroyed or recalled is causing confusion for free folk settlements. Arya's voice cut in, quiet but firm. Some of them are near the gorge. Tormund's men destroyed a group of wandering whites that attacked a settlement. It's not an organized assault, just mindless stragglers. Daenerys listened, her posture tense. Is there any sign the Night King orchestrates these attacks? Bran answered, his voice light and distant as though carried on the wind. No. If the Night King were commanding them, their movements would be more deliberate. These are remnants, like wind-up toys left to roam until they rust. But they're dangerous all the same. A silence fell. Sansa studied Daenerys for a moment, her cool gaze considering more than just the problem at hand. We can deal with scattered whites, Sansa said at last, but we can't handle another war with them. And we can't assume the Night King will stay quiet forever. Jon raked a hand through his hair. He's not attacked or threatened us since the Titans' defeat. We have no reason to provoke him. But even as he said the words, he felt the weight of uncertainty. The realm stood on a delicate seesaw of possibilities. One wrong tilt and the fragile piece might crack wide open. Daenerys gazed at the flickering candle, deep in thought. The last time we saw him, he marched north with his whites. There was a sense of finality, as if the conflict was over. Yet we can't ignore that he remains part of this world. Whether he emerges as foe or ally again could depend on what we do now. Arya tilted her head. We could send envoys beyond the wall. Tormund, perhaps. Or even me. To see if the Night King would meet. But what would that accomplish? Sansa's eyebrows rose. Negotiate a permanent peace treaty with an ancient, undead being who seldom speaks? Jon's lips formed a grim line. A year ago, I would have laughed at the thought. But we've seen impossible things come to pass. If this realm is to avoid a new conflict in the future, we may need clarity. Though I wonder if disturbing him is wise. Bran's eyes shifted to the weirwood staff at his side. He's already aware that the North thrives. He watches more closely than you think. For now, he seems content in isolation. He paused, letting the words fall into the hush. However, isolation doesn't always last. They spoke at length about the best course of action, the words swirling in circles. In the end, no firm decision was made, only a mutual understanding that they could not remain complacent. The realm was battered, the people weary. Another open confrontation with the Night King could be catastrophic. Yet ignoring the potential threat completely would be folly. With reluctant acceptance, they tabled the issue for another day. That night, Winterfell's fires glowed bright against the star-strewn sky. Soldiers in the courtyard gathered around open pits, telling stories to chase away lingering dread. Inside, the lords and ladies of the North mingled with Daenerys' retinue. Tormund, red-bearded and boisterous, boasted about how he had wrestled a frost-touched beast with his bare hands, though some suspected he embellished the details. Gendry Baratheon, present to negotiate forging contracts, found himself cornered by half-drunk knights who wanted to hear tall tales of the final battle. Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth were away in the Riverlands, securing alliances, but their presence was felt in the murmur of talk about new laws and reforms. The mood was subdued but not grim. People had begun to remember how to laugh. Jon found a quiet moment on one of the covered walkways, staring out at the courtyard below. Firelight cast shifting patterns across the stone, and laughter drifted upward in waves. He felt a shadow at his shoulder. Turning, he saw Daenerys. She wore a dark wool cloak, her silver hair braided simply. The wind teased the ends of it across her face. She stepped beside him, silent for a time. Then she said, "Sometimes I forget what life was like before all of this." Jon understood. Before armies of the dead, before forging a bond with the Night King to save the world, before the catastrophic war that nearly ended everything. "We've seen more than we ever asked to see," he said softly. She rested her elbows on the parapet. "I used to dream of a glorious conquest. To sit on the Iron Throne as my ancestors did. Now I wonder if that throne even matters. The realm needs peace, not more crowns." Jon glanced at her, appreciating the shift in her tone. Once, her ambition had been unyielding. Now it was tempered by reality. "You are a queen," he reminded her, recognized by many. "You can do good from the position you hold." She sighed, a faint smile touching her lips. "Yes. But I also see how easily that power can slip through my fingers if the lords decide to chase another rumor or if fear clouds their hearts. What we faced at Winterfell, no one will fully understand unless they were there." Jon nodded. "Aye. We can only keep moving forward. Our enemies now are famine, disease, feuds over farmland, and maybe the threat lurking in the far north. At least none of those are unstoppable armies of the dead." She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, briefly letting go of the weight of rulership. They stood in a calm hush, listening to the murmurs of conversation below. Once, they had been lovers bound by the intensity of war. Now, they were something else, perhaps deeper, two monarchs bound by shared scars, drawn together not by the flames of passion alone, but by a tempered bond of understanding. Eventually, He stepped away, pulling her cloak tighter. I'll be heading south again soon. I must see to the growth of my new capital near the ruins of Old Town. King's Landing is stable for the moment, but it's fragile. My advisors think establishing a seat of power in a more fertile region will help unify the people. Less memory of the Mad King's final days. Jon touched her hand. Safe travels. The North will watch your skies for your return. She departed with a bittersweet smile, and Jon lingered on the walkway until the chill forced him inside. Each time she left, he felt the ache of separation, but he knew their roles demanded distance. The realm was vast, and they both had crowns to bear. At least they parted in peace, with no crisis demanding immediate bloodshed. In the following weeks, a kind of equilibrium settled over Winterfell. The roads improved. More farmland was tilled. The training yard echoed with disciplined practice. Market stalls opened, offering salted fish from White Harbor and furs from the far north. Children ran through the corridors, shrieking with laughter, unburdened by the horrors their parents remembered. Even the old words, "winter is coming," took on a milder meaning. Winter had come, yes, and it had nearly destroyed the world. But now they had turned the page to a hesitant spring. Yet no peace in Westeros lasts indefinitely. Whispers began circulating of discontent in the Iron Islands. Yara Greyjoy, ruling in the wake of her uncle Euron's defeat, faced internal rebellions from Iron-born captains who felt her allegiances to the mainland compromised their proud independence. Some threatened to revert to Reaving if not granted new privileges. The North did not wish to provoke the Ironborn, but they also couldn't allow them to plunder the coastline at will. Letters flew back and forth between Winterfell and Pike, each more tense than the last. Simultaneously, the Dornish complained that they had invested men and resources in the final war only to see scarce gratitude from the Northern Crown. The new Prince of Dorne demanded trade concessions and symbolic gestures of recognition. Sansa found herself buried under a mountain of correspondence, each letter or raven scroll a reminder that though the dead had been beaten back, the living had enough conflicts of their own to threaten the realm's fragile stability. Jon tried to address these challenges with patience, relying on Davos Seaworth's advice. Old Onion Knight though he was, Davos had a knack for soothing resentful lords by appealing to their sense of honor and practicality. Tyrion, when he was present, lent his cunning insights, though his official seat remained near King's Landing. Still, tensions mounted in the corners of Westeros, each potential spark threatening to light a tinderbox of grievances. And always overshadowing these mortal worries was the knowledge that something older and colder lay to the north. Then came an unexpected missive delivered by a haggard free folk scout who'd traveled weeks in the snowy wastes. He arrived at Winterfell's gates half-dead from exposure. Once revived in the warmth of the Great Hall, he told a story that seized everyone's attention. At a small settlement far beyond the New Gift, a group of whites had appeared, only this time they did not attack. They carried with them battered old crates containing artifacts from the Age of Heroes, rusted swords, bits of broken weirwood figurines, scattered runes. They left the crates at the edge of the settlement, then marched away into the night. The bewildered free folk, remembering the alliance that once saved them, dared not strike first. They recognized it as another gesture from the Night King or his servants, but to what end? Word of this bizarre gift spread through Winterfell's corridors like wildfire. Some scoffed, calling it a mind game meant to sow confusion. Others deemed it an olive branch. Bran studied the artifacts, running his fingers over the ancient runes, his gaze distant. He confirmed they were indeed from a bygone era, items once associated with the first men, the children of the forest, and possibly the original pacts that had bound the realms of men and the powers of ice. Night after night, Jon deliberated with Sansa, Arya, and Bran about what it might mean. The question burned in him: if the Night King had truly relinquished his old role as adversary, was he trying to restore something resembling the ancient pact between humans and the powers of the North? Or was there another threat on the horizon he wished to forewarn them about? Perhaps, as Bran had said, the Night King felt displaced in a world that no longer followed the pattern of cyclical conflict he had known for thousands of years. In the end, Jon resolved to send an expedition beyond the Wall, a small, carefully chosen group to investigate the significance of these artifacts and seek direct contact. The decision was not taken lightly. Every instinct told him this was a perilous move. But ignoring this sign could be worse. He recalled the memory of forging that desperate alliance once before. Sometimes, the only way to avoid a future catastrophe was to confront the unknown directly. Arya volunteered immediately, a glint of determination in her eyes. Tormund also stepped forward, explaining that he knew the northern terrain better than most and had no fear of wights now that the Night King seemed less hostile. A handful of free folk rangers also pledged to join. Gendry offered to accompany them, no longer just a blacksmith but a skilled warrior in his own right, though Jon worried about placing the newly recognized Lord Baratheon in danger. Gendry insisted that forging alliances and securing peace was every lord's duty, no matter how dark the path. Jon debated going himself but was dissuaded by Sansa and Davos. The North needed its king. If he rode beyond the wall and did not return, the realm could spiral into chaos. He reluctantly agreed, though his heart twisted at the thought of Arya walking into that emptiness without him. But she reassured him with a quiet confidence. She was no child of illusions. She knew how to kill, how to hide, how to survive in the harshest conditions. If the Night King meant harm, he would find her a worthy foe. If he meant peace, perhaps she was the perfect messenger, deadly enough to command respect, yet bearing the Stark name as a bridge. The expedition set out in the twilight hours, ghostly pale dawn creeping over the horizon. Their horses snorted in the cold, hooves crunching on the frosted ground. A chill wind scoured the bare trees. At the head of the group, Arya rode with Tormund on one side and Gendry on the other. Ghost, too, loped along silently as if refusing to let Arya venture alone. They carried supplies sufficient for weeks, plus dragaglass weapons just in case. The gates of Winterfell creaked open and the band of a dozen riders disappeared into the distance. Jon watched from the battlements, cloak snapping around him, the bitter air cutting his cheeks. Sansa stood at his side, arms wrapped around herself for warmth. Neither spoke, each lost in private hopes and fears. Once the riders vanished from sight, Jon exhaled a shaky breath and lowered his gaze. It was done. Days slipped into weeks. No raven arrived. No scout returned with news. A biting impatience gnawed at Jon. He tried to focus on the tasks of governance, resolving quarrels, balancing trade, fortifying roads. But always at the back of his mind, he imagined Arya striding through the white wastes, searching for any sign of the undead. At night, his dreams were haunted by images of swirling snow and ice-blue eyes flickering in the dark. Finally, on a misty morning, a horn sounded at Winterfell's outer wall. Jon rushed to the courtyard to see the guard raising the portcullis. A group of riders limped in, horses exhausted, furs caked with snow and mud. Tormund slid off his saddle, as big and imposing as ever, but the lines of his face were etched deeper, his eyes shadowed. Arya was there too, pale but upright, leading her horse by the reins. Gendry, hunched and shivering, clutched his cloak tight. Ghost padded beside them, fur matted with ice. 2 of the free folk rangers were missing. Jon hurried forward. "You're safe." Arya inclined her head, too tired to muster a smile. "We are. But we've seen things you need to hear about." Sansa and Davos appeared, along with Sam and a few others. They ushered the expedition into the great hall, offering hot soup and mulled wine while servants rushed to stable the horses. The returning party warmed themselves by the hearth's flames, and gradually, as the tension in their bones eased, they began to speak. Arya told of a journey that took them far beyond Craster's Keep, past haunted forests where the silhouettes of dead trees loomed like silent sentinels. They found empty white tracks heading ever northward. One night, they spotted a cluster of the undead encircling a cave. The whites did not attack, they simply stood watch as though guarding something. In that cave, by the flickering glow of lanterns, the expedition discovered a hidden chamber full of weirwood carvings and archaic symbols that none recognized. The whites made no move against them. They allowed Arya and her companions to take rubbings of the carvings to inspect them. Only when the rangers tried to pry a chunk of weirwood from the wall did a faint hiss of warning fill the air, and the whites shifted, brandishing ice blades. Tormund chimed in, describing how a night later, they glimpsed a lone figure in the distance, tall and cloaked in black, with eyes that glowed in unearthly blue. The figure raised a hand in silent greeting, then vanished into the swirling snow, leaving behind footsteps that froze the ground solid. Gendry confirmed that it was definitely the Night King, or at least a White Walker of immense power. But no violence ensued. The undead simply kept watch. Arya's voice quivered slightly as she continued. "It was as if they wanted us to see that cave. As if they were guiding us to those symbols." Her eyes flicked to Bran, who had joined the group in his chair, gazing into the fire. "I could feel something. Not quite hostility, but a presence older than anything I've known." Jon leaned forward, hands gripping the table. "So, what do we make of these symbols?" Sam, already scanning the rubbings, looked up. "They resemble the patterns left by the White Walkers in the past. Spirals. Circles. But they're more intricate here. Combined with runes that might be from the Children of the Forest." This could be a record, perhaps an ancient memory of how the first pacts were made or broken. Bran closed his eyes, letting out a slow breath. After a moment, he spoke. I can sense a whisper of it now. It's about the forging of an accord between living and dead, a means to maintain balance. The first long night ended not just because the others were driven away, but because there was an understanding. But over centuries, that understanding was undone by betrayal, leading to cyclical wars. Now, with the Titan destroyed, the old cycle has shattered. The Night King doesn't seem to know what to do except reach out in echoes of the past. Sansa's expression hardened. So these artifacts, these symbols, are some form of communication. Telling us the Night King wants a permanent treaty? Arya shrugged, exhaustion lacing her features. Maybe, but we lost 2 good free folk rangers. They wandered off one night and never came back. We found no sign of them, no remains. The Whites didn't harm us, but that doesn't mean the entire north beyond the wall is safe. Gendry murmured. It was the strangest feeling, traveling in that domain without direct conflict. The cold there. You'd think it would be hostile, but it felt like we were trespassing in someone else's hall, not a battlefield. Jon rubbed at his beard, tension rippling through him. So the Night King's showing us these clues, these ancient runes. Why? To negotiate, or to invite us into some unknown darkness. Bran's eyes remained closed, as though listening to a distant wind. The Night King was created by the children of the forest to protect them from men, then turned on his creators. He spent eons locked in conflict, forging whites to overrun the living. But for the first time, he's tasted a different path. Perhaps he seeks to uphold what was once an ancient vow, that men and the powers of winter would coexist, provided each side honored the boundaries. Only the boundaries have changed. Sansa glanced at Jon, lips pressed tight. If that's true, what would an accord even look like? We can't exactly invite the Night King to feasts and tourneys. A grim sort of irony flickered in Jon's eyes. We already fought a war together. For one terrible, glorious night, we stood side by side. That may be the only sign of trust he can offer. The idea of forging a formal treaty with the White Walkers felt absurd. Yet the alternative was ignoring the signs until conflict erupted again. The Titan's threat had nearly ended the world. This at least seemed a chance to spare future generations from a second cataclysm. Jon decided they must glean everything they could from these carvings and runes, perhaps glean a means to formalize the fragile peace. If the Night King himself was uncertain, maybe the impetus had to come from the living. In the days that followed, Sam, Bran, and even Qyburn, who had been quietly working in Winterfell's laboratories, having nowhere else to go after Cersei's fall, poured over the rubbings from the cave. Qyburn's presence unnerved many, given his history of necromantic curiosities, but Jon had allowed him to stay under guard and supervision. Qyburn's knowledge of obscure magics was sometimes useful, though no one fully trusted him. He had once raised the mountain as a hulking undead thrall, after all. Between them, they pieced together fragments of an ancient incantation. It seemed to detail how the first men and the children of the forest shared wards, magical boundaries, to keep the White Walkers in their realm and men in theirs. Over millennia, those wards eroded. The new inscriptions hinted at a method of reestablishing them, not as a fortress wall of ice but as a symbolic covenant ensuring that the others would not cross south in wrath, and men would not trespass wantonly into the haunted north. It was a tall order, given the centuries of bloodshed. Jon held counsel with the Northern Lords, who balked at the notion of any treaty that recognized the Night King as something akin to a sovereign of the far north. Many had lost friends and kin to whites. The Great War's memory was still raw, but Sansa, Davos, and other trusted voices pointed out that permanent vigilance was necessary whether they forged a treaty or not. The question was whether they sought to stave off another apocalypse by creating a stable boundary or risk another invasion the moment the Night King's uncertainty turned back to hostility. The lords wrangled over the idea for days, some storming out in disgust at the mere notion of negotiating with ice demons. Others, worn down by the memory of tragedy, argued in favor of any measure that might prevent renewed carnage. In the end, the conflict came down to trust in Jon's leadership. He was the king in the north, the man who had once brokered peace with the free folk, then allied with Daenerys, then stood beside the Night King against the Titan. His track record of improbable truces might just see them through once more. After a stormy meeting in the Great Hall, the lords begrudgingly gave Jon their blessing to attempt a new treaty on one strict condition: House Stark must hold final authority. If the Night King violated the boundary, the entire North would respond with immediate force. Jon, though uneasy, agreed. It was the only path to ensure unity in the event of betrayal. Still, the question loomed: how did one negotiate such an accord with an entity that spoke no mortal language, that communicated through symbols, psychic impressions, and the silent movements of the dead? Bran offered to serve as a conduit. Through his powers as the Three-Eyed Raven, he could attempt to commune with the Night King, bridging the gap between human speech and the ancient language of winter. But it would be perilous, for the Night King possessed formidable magic that could trap or corrupt minds who ventured too close. Jon refused to risk Bran alone, remembering how the Night King once marked him with a touch that broke wards. The plan would require a place of relative safety, a weirwood stronghold. The godwood at Winterfell might suffice if the Night King was willing to come south in peace, an unnerving thought, to invite the King of the Dead to the seat of House Stark. Davos pointed out a simpler solution: meet at the Wall, the once great boundary between realms. Though it was damaged beyond repair in places, Eastwatch still stood in partial ruin, and the power in the stones might hold relics of old enchantments. If a meeting was to happen, that ground might be more neutral. Jon latched onto the idea. The memory of the Wall as a line between the living and the dead was strong in every mind. If they were to forge a new boundary, let them do so at the very spot that had once served that purpose for generations. Thus, letters were sent out calling for a small but determined assembly at Eastwatch by the Sea. Lords of the North, representatives of the Free Folk, and any allies who believed in this desperate attempt at peace. Jon wrote to Daenerys, urging her presence. For if any living soul embodied the power that could match the Night King, it was she. Tyrion, Gendry, and others would also come. Bran would be there to guide the magical aspect of the negotiation. Tormund, who knew Eastwatch well, would coordinate the logistics. The plan was bold, perhaps reckless, but boldness had saved them before. As the date approached, Winterfell buzzed with anxious activity. Weapons were sharpened, dragonglass was stockpiled, supplies packed. Not an invasion, but a carefully prepared force that could defend itself if the meeting turned lethal. The uneasy alliance from the last war would stand ready. Dragons above, men on the ground, cunning minds orchestrating it all. A single misstep could plunge them into a new conflict with the dead. Yet if they succeeded, if they truly could hammer out an accord, the entire realm might know an era of safety beyond anything in living memory. Finally, the chosen day arrived. The retinue set off in a great column, heading for Eastwatch. Snow had retreated from most of the roads, though pockets of winter still lingered in the shadowy forests. At the head of the procession rode Jon Snow, flanked by Sansa and Arya. Bran traveled in a sturdy wagon, accompanied by Davos, Sam, and Podrick, the latter guiding the horses with steady hands. Tyrion Lannister appeared en route, having sailed north from the Crownlands and joined them at White Harbor. He wore a troubled expression, but also a spark of intrigue in his eyes. Gendry arrived soon after, freshly recovered from his trek beyond the Wall. The Vale and Riverlands sent small contingents as a show of support. The Free Folk, led by Tormund, scouted ahead, forging a path through the quieter parts of the land once plagued by the undead. And above it all, Daenerys soared in on Drogon and Rhaegal, the dragons casting shadows like thunderclouds over the caravan. They made camp near the once mighty wall, now partially collapsed in sections. Eastwatch's towers stood battered but still functional, the outer defenses patched with logs and stones. The sea crashed against the shore, where broken ice floes bobbed and churned. The bitter wind carried the tang of salt and a memory of old battles. Here, where the Night King once crossed with a dragon of ice, they now hoped to greet him in peace. The irony was not lost on Jon. They fortified their camp. Guards stood in vigilant lines. No one knew exactly when or how the Night King would appear, if at all. Days passed, filled with a tense hush. Some men joked to hide their fear, others prayed. Occasionally, Daenerys flew overhead, scanning the horizon for any movement. But the land remained eerily still. At night, the cold seemed to intensify, creeping through bedrolls and tents no matter how many fires they lit. It was as though the northern wind was testing their resolve. On the 7th day of waiting, a shout went up from the watchtower. Shapes moved across the frozen expanse beyond Eastwatch. The watchers braced themselves, hearts hammering. Jon ascended the ramparts, Sansa and Arya at his side, while Bran remained in his wagon, eyes closed, preparing. They saw a long line of figures in the distance, whites, rank upon rank, marching silently, their pale forms glinting in the wan light. At the column's forefront strode the Night King himself, tall and regal in his otherworldly stillness. A hush fell over Eastwatch. Even the winds seemed to pause, as if in deference or dread. Every man, woman, and child felt a primal jolt of terror. Memories of devastation flickered. This was the foe who once nearly destroyed them. Jon steeled his nerves, recalling the moment that enemy had turned ally against the Titan. Behind him, Daenerys alighted with Drogon on a rocky outcropping, ready to unleash fire if the Whites attacked. The Night King halted a bowshot from the broken gates. His Whites stood behind him in disciplined rows. No snarling, no attempt to advance. Both sides faced each other under a bruised gray sky. Jon motioned for the gates to open. The living parted in a corridor, hearts pounding. The Night King moved alone through that corridor, the Whites remaining outside. All eyes followed him, every hand close to a weapon. Arya stood near Jon, her dagger hidden in her sleeve, ready for any sign of aggression. As the Night King entered Eastwatch's courtyard, the temperature plummeted. Frost crawled across the stones at his feet. His azure eyes took in the array of men and women, flicked to the dragons perched overhead, studied the banners of House Stark and Targaryen fluttering in the breeze. The hush was so absolute that one could hear the slow drip of melting ice from the ramparts. Jon stepped forward, breath rasping. "We've come to meet you in peace." No reply came in human tongue. Instead, a subtle wave of power rippled across the courtyard. Many living onlookers shuddered, backs tensing. Bran, seated in his wagon with Sam by his side, exhaled sharply. He opened his eyes, which glistened with a milky sheen. For an instant, it seemed the Night King's gaze locked with Bran's, forging a tenuous bridge. A sense of cold seeped into every corner of the watchers' minds, as though the entire scene hovered on the brink of a dream. Bran spoke, though his voice carried an echo not entirely his own. "He acknowledges your invitation. He comes to seek the new boundary." A collective murmur passed through the crowd. Tyrion blinked rapidly, as if to ground himself in the real world. Jon nodded, forcing steadiness into his voice. "We stand ready to discuss a lasting truce between the realms of men and the realm of ice." Bran's eyes unfocused for a moment. Then he spoke again, seemingly channeling words that were not his. "He remembers the old pacts. He seeks a binding vow, so that neither side will threaten the other." Jon exchanged a glance with Sansa, whose face was unreadable. The Night King did not move, save for the faint stirring of his cloak in the wind. Snowflakes drifted around him like silent ghosts. The tension in the courtyard felt like a drawn bowstring. Any misstep, and thousands of Whites beyond the wall could surge forward. With measured calm, Jon began to recite the terms they had painstakingly devised. The White Walkers and their Whites would remain in the far north, never again crossing south in aggression. In return, the lands of men would cease any attempts to conquer or destroy the far north. The boundaries would be re-established, though not with a magical wall of ice. Rather with wards placed in weirwood groves from Eastwatch to the Shadow Tower, possibly extending beyond. Both parties would uphold the vow, with the three-eyed raven acting as a guardian to ensure none broke it. If any new threat, like the Titan, arose that endangered all existence, they would come to each other's aid once more. As Jon spoke, the Night King remained still, the icy glow of his eyes unwavering. A swirl of psychic energy played about the courtyard. Whites beyond the gates shifted, but none advanced. Daenerys watched from her vantage point, ready to command Drogon at any sign of treachery. But for now, the undead host held. It was a negotiation unlike any Westeros had ever seen. Once Jon finished outlining the terms, Bran breathed deeply, his gaze lost in the space between realms. A murmur that felt like ancient wind swept through him. Then he spoke in that dual voice again. "The Night King agrees to the wards, if they are sealed in blood and magic. The vow must be sanctified in weirwood and dragonfire." Daenerys stiffened at those last words. She descended from her perch, approaching carefully, Drogon looming behind her with a low rumble in his throat. She met Jon's eyes. Dragonfire? Bran's lips parted, the presence within him swirling. He recalls the forging of the first wards, shaped by the children and blessed with fire from the earth. Now only Dragonfire remains. It must burn the runes into the weirwood, locking the wards in place. Then the vow will be sealed. A ripple of apprehension crossed the watchers. To bring a dragon near the weirwood groves was no small thing. Such trees were sacred to the old gods. Yet the vow demanded a potent combination of powers. Jon thought of the cost. If forging this boundary might spare them centuries of bloodshed, it could be worth it. Sansa, standing near Jon, ventured quietly, and the blood. Bran's eyes flicked to her. A drop from both sides. The king in the north, the Night King, the living and the dead. Jon's heart thudded. Blood magic was never undertaken lightly. But in this moment any lesser pact might be meaningless. He clenched his jaw, turned to the Night King. Then let it be done. Bran exhaled and the eerie resonance in his tone dimmed. The Night King inclined his head an infinitesimal motion but enough to confirm acceptance. The Watchers exhaled as one. The realization crashed over them that they were about to enact a binding magical treaty with the embodiment of winter's darkness. Preparations ensued swiftly. Under Tormund's direction, they cleared a safe path to a ring of weirwood stumps near the base of the ruined wall, a place where the children of the forest had once performed rites, if rumors held true. Daenerys summoned Drogon and Rhaegal to the site, their massive forms a living symbol of fire's might. The Night King instructed a group of wights to carry ancient stones inscribed with runes from some hidden cache in the north. When the wights arrived, men flinched away. A line of Unsullied under Grey Worm's command held a nervous perimeter. Tension coiled in every breath, but for now no blow was struck. In the center of the ring, Bran took position, staff in hand, his eyes closed in concentration. He directed Sam to place the weirwood runes on the ground in a specific spiral formation. Qyburn hovered at the edge, scribbling notes, half fascinated, half terrified. Tyrion and Davos oversaw the living presence, ensuring no one panicked. Sansa and Arya stood close to Jon, bracing for whatever came next. The Night King stood opposite them, silent, an unsettling statue of frost and pale flesh. A hush fell as Bran raised his voice, chanting words older than the common tongue, likely gleaned from his glimpses into the past. The sound thrummed through the air, reverberating in the Watcher's bones. The weirwood runes on the ground glowed faintly as if a hidden flame danced within the grain of the wood. The Night King lifted one hand, causing a subtle shift of ice-blue luminescence to flow along his arm. In response, the runes pulsed, an interplay of ancient magics colliding. Bran then guided Jon with a gesture. Jon stepped forward, drawing a small knife of dragoglass. Every instinct told him this was madness. He was bearing himself in front of a being who once tried to kill all mankind. But the trust they had built in that final battle against the Titan weighed on him. If there was any moment to solidify a new era, it was now. He drew the blade across his palm, wincing as a line of blood welled. Then he dripped the blood onto the central rune, where it sizzled faintly, turning the pale wood a darker shade of crimson. The Night King followed suit, if one could call it that. His hand appeared uncut, but from beneath his pale skin, a single drop of blackish-blue fluid formed at his fingertip. It fell onto the rune beside Jon's blood, mingling in a swirl that smoked on contact. A jolt of energy snapped through the air, causing men to jump and horses to neigh in alarm. Bran's chant rose in pitch. The weirwood spiral glowed brighter, as though fed by the combined essence of living and dead. Daenerys took the next step. She climbed atop Drogon and, at Bran's nod, commanded the dragon to release a short burst of flame, not the full fury he might unleash in battle, but enough to scorch the runes. Fire erupted, swirling around the ring without catching the rest of the clearing ablaze. Rhaegal joined in, exhaling his own blaze. The Watchers shielded their eyes from the brightness, ears ringing with the roar of dragon flame. Within that conflagration, the combined blood of Jon and the Night King hissed, binding into the wood. A pungent, powerful smell flooded the clearing, half smoke, half ozone, tinged with ancient magic. The flame died away as quickly as it had come, leaving only a circle of smoldering weirwood, etched with symbols now charred into the ground. Jon stepped back, feeling sweat mingle with the sting of the cut on his hand. The Night King remained unmoving, though a faint shimmer of frost emanated from him, cooling the ground. Bran's chant subsided, and he sank back with a weary sigh. The hush that followed was profound. Jon looked from the scorched weirwood spiral to the Night King, searching for a sign of acceptance. The air felt charged, as though creation itself held its breath. Then the Night King gave another slow, glacial nod. A wave of psychic impression washed over the watchers. They sensed finality, an accord reached, a boundary set. The vow was sealed in the living root of the earth and the dragon's flame. On some deep, primal level, the intangible lines separating the realms of men and the others had been redrawn. In that moment, a collective exhalation swept the watchers, a letting go of an old dread. Some bowed their heads, others simply stood stunned. Tormund let out a low whistle. Arya, fists clenched at her sides, relaxed fractionally, though her eyes never left the Night King's form. Sansa pressed a hand to her chest, her gaze flicking to Jon, relief warring with astonishment. Tyrion, arms folded, breathed a silent prayer that the future would justify this risk. The Night King stepped back, and whites beyond the clearing stirred, as if awaiting a command. With a final glance at Jon, he turned and began walking north. The whites fell in line behind him, a silent exodus into the distant whiteness. No one tried to stop them. This time, there was no dread of an imminent slaughter. Instead, there was an uncanny acceptance of a peace that no one had believed possible. When the last white vanished over the horizon, the watchers at Eastwatch realized it was over. Or, perhaps more accurately, something new had begun. A boundary sealed by living blood, undead essence, and dragon fire. Jon rested a hand on his sword hilt, wishing he could make sense of the swirl of emotion in his heart: relief, triumph, lingering fear, and an odd pang of sorrow for the strangeness of this moment. The greatest foe of humankind had just concluded a peace treaty in front of their eyes. Davos let out a breath. 7 hells. Did we truly just do that? Tyrion managed a half-laugh, half-groan. Seems so. May the gods help us understand what it all means. Daenerys dismounted Drogon, her cheeks flushed from the dragon's heat. She and Jon exchanged a long look. He saw pride in her eyes and caution. We've taken another step into a future no one could have foreseen, she said softly. Sansa moved closer to Bran, who was recovering in his chair, looking spent. She placed a hand on his shoulder. Are you all right? Bran nodded, though his features were drawn. Yes. The vow is in place. For now, the North will be at peace with him. Arya let out a slow exhale. Peace with the Night King. I never thought I'd see the day. They gathered around the charred spiral, feeling the faint crackle of residual magic underfoot. The day was cold, but the sun peeked through a rift in the clouds, bathing them in pale light. All around, the watchers began to stir, uncertain whether to cheer or to simply pick up and carry on. Life in Westeros seldom gave time to reflect. So many battles, betrayals, and sudden shifts had left them wary of any lasting calm. But a calm it was, at least in that moment. Jon closed his eyes for a heartbeat. He pictured the Titan's cataclysmic approach, the day the Night King knelt in that final war. Now he saw the same being departing without malice. The cycle was broken, or at least reshaped. Perhaps the realms of men and the realm of ice would remain separate for centuries. Perhaps new threats would surface in the future. But for now, the living had forged a promise with the dead, impossible, unthinkable, yet real. If that was not a cause for hope, what could be? In the following days, as the living host departed Eastwatch and spread the news of the extraordinary treaty, ripples of astonishment coursed through the land. Some lords refused to believe it. Others accepted it with a kind of weary gratitude. The free folk breathed easier knowing they no longer had to fear legions of whites devouring their homes. Daenerys, Tyrion, and the southern lords recognized it as a victory of diplomacy that might overshadow any petty crowns. The entire tapestry of Westeros's future had shifted. Jon led his people back to Winterfell, where the final details of the wards were hammered out. Weirwood staves inscribed with the newly forged runes were placed along the old line of the wall, supplemented by dragonfire ceremonies performed by Daenerys or, when she was absent, by the guidance of Rhaegal alone. It was an immense effort, but one greeted with determined optimism. House Stark oversaw the operation, maintaining unity among the various lords who contributed men and resources. As the months wore on, the North began to experience the gentlest spring it had seen in decades. The snows still lingered in the high passes, but green shoots poked through the once icy fields, and the wind carried a hint of warmth. Farmers prepared for planting. Merchants arrived from the Riverlands and the Vale, marveling at how calm the North felt despite the knowledge that the Night King still existed, far beyond those new wards. Tales spread of how House Stark had tamed winter itself, forging alliances with the darkest powers to ensure a future for all. For a time, Jon allowed himself a measure of contentment. He strolled through Winterfell's courtyard, greeting old soldiers who had become farmers, patting the heads of children who ran laughing among the stalls. He dined with Sansa and Arya, sharing quiet stories of their childhood, marveling at how far they'd come. When Daenerys visited, they walked along the walls hand in hand, discussing the next steps for improving trade and uniting the realm under a peace unthinkable in the days of constant warfare. Even Tyrion admitted that for once the realm seemed stable, a precarious stability perhaps, but something new. Yet the scars remained. Many families mourned lost kin. The memory of Hardhome, the Battle of Winterfell, and the final stand against the Titan clung to those who had witnessed it. Some nights, Jon woke in a cold sweat, recalling the avalanche of ice, the hiss of whites surging against them. But each time, he found reassurance in the knowledge that they had persevered, forging an alliance that transcended hatred. Months gave way to a year, and the northern fields broke out in wildflowers. Tormund led the free folk beyond the wards to confirm that the Night King's domain remained quiet, with no sign of aggression. Indeed, the old snow-laden wastes felt strangely empty, as if the whites had retreated into deeper hidden regions. Occasionally, travelers reported glimpses of solitary White Walkers or whites collecting wood or shaping strange ice sculptures in remote valleys. But no attacks followed. It was as if a truce truly held. Thus life blossomed in a realm that had nearly died. Roads were paved, alliances strengthened. Houses that once feuded found themselves cooperating under the watchful governance of House Stark and the Targaryen monarchy in the south. The kingdoms never became a perfect utopia. Greed and ambition still stirred in mortal hearts, as they always would. But the terrifying shadow of the undead receded into the domain of old legends rather than daily dread. One evening, a pair of ravens arrived at Winterfell's rookery, carrying letters from distant corners of Westeros. One was from Jaime Lannister and Brienne of Tarth, who had successfully brokered peace among the Riverlords, allowing trade to flow northward unimpeded. Another came from Gendry, who had further stabilized the Stormlands. Reading these letters in her solar, Sansa smiled at how far they had come from the days of madness in King's Landing. Jon entered, and she shared the good news, each relieved at the calm that had settled over the land. That night, they held a modest feast in Winterfell's great hall. Northern bannermen sat at wooden tables, passing jugs of ale and trays of roasted meat. Musicians played lively tunes. The hall was thick with the smell of smoke, spiced wine, and laughter. Jon sat at the high table with Sansa, Arya, Bran, Davos, and a handful of close companions. They raised cups to absent friends, Daenerys, Tyrion, Tormund, and toasted the memory of those who had fought in the final war. Amid the revelry, Bran's gaze drifted, and he slipped away from the table, wheeling himself quietly into the godswood. Arya noticed and followed, concerned. She found him near the heart tree, the moonlight filtering through red leaves, painting his face in silver and shadow. Bran turned his head as she approached. "It's a beautiful night." She nodded. "Why did you leave the feast?" He looked down, hands resting on the arms of his chair. "Sometimes the living world feels distant. I see so many threads of time, so many possibilities. It's comforting to observe the feast from within, but also overwhelming." Arya studied him for a moment, remembering the boy he had been, eager to climb towers, hungry for stories. Now he was a near-omniscient figure who had carried them through an age of nightmares. "Are you all right?" He gave a small smile. "Yes, more or less. I was just reflecting on how we averted another long night. On the treaty with the Night King. The realm is at peace." She stepped closer. "That's good, isn't it?" "Of course. But the wheel of time keeps turning. The future is never fixed. As much as we've reshaped fate, new perils could emerge from corners we've never dreamed of. And the Night King, he may abide by the vow for 1,000 years or a mere 100. In the face of eternity, that's but a breath." Arya placed a hand on his shoulder. "We can't control what happens centuries from now. We can only do our best with the time we have." Bran nodded. You're right. We have peace now, which is more than the realms had in a long, long time. I suppose that's enough. She sensed a current of sadness in his tone, but also acceptance. The gods' wood was quiet around them, the rustle of leaves like a gentle lullaby. Arya thought of her own place in this new world. Trained as a killer, a survivor, now forging a life in a realm that seemed to need fewer blades. Yet she was content to remain vigilant. If darkness ever threatened again, the wolves of House Stark would be ready. They returned to the hall, where laughter and music carried on late into the night. There were toasts to the White Wolf, to the Three-Eyed Raven, to the Lady of Winterfell, and to the Quiet Blade. Each Stark had earned a name in this epoch of transformation. Outside, the moonlight gleamed on the snows that still adorned the distant peaks. Within, life pulsed in defiance of the cold. Eventually, the feast dispersed, and the castle sank into slumber. Jon, Sansa, and Arya parted ways, each heading to their chambers. Ghost padded through the corridors, patrolling with that quiet dignity of direwolves. The fires in the hearths sank to embers. A hush settled over Winterfell, and far beyond the wards, in the silent vastness of the far north, the Night King moved through drifting snow, the silent whites at his side. He no longer felt the restless compulsion to march south. The vow settled around him like a cloak of frost, guiding his footsteps along ancient paths. At times, he paused near weirwood stands, sensing the faint resonance of the wards etched by living blood and dragonfire. For the first time in eons, his existence was not defined solely by war or the reanimation of the dead. In that hush of the eternal night, he carried the memory of forging a truce that might span ages. The azure glow of his eyes reflected starlight off the ice, and he strode ever onward, a solitary king in a realm that was now truly his own. In Winterfell's bedchambers, Jon dreamed of a field of white, a swirl of snow, and a figure that bowed its head to him before vanishing into the swirl. He woke with a sense of peace he could not quite explain. Across the castle, Sansa woke early to see a sunrise tinted gold and pink. She found the air less biting, as though the north itself took a gentler breath. Bran, in his tower, cast his mind across ravens that soared over forests greening in the earliest days of a new season. Arya, sharpening her dagger out of habit, felt a flicker of contentment that she'd rarely known. There might still be shadows lurking in the future, but for now, the realm they had fought so hard to protect savored a quiet dawn. Time would decide how the songs were written, whether they spoke of the Night King as a demon who became an ally, or whether they spun tall tales of House Stark taming winter's fury with cunning and courage. In the living memory of those who bore witness, however, the truth was etched in blood and snow. They knew that on a day when all reason said it was impossible, they stood face to face with the King of the Dead and forged a promise. And that promise allowed life to bloom once more in the battered soil of Westeros. So it was that House Stark, guardians of the North and the guiding beacon for a scarred realm, ushered in an age of relative peace unknown in living memory. The vow with the Night King marked a new chapter in the history of men and the powers of ice. The scars of the wars would remain, but so would the wisdom gained. In time, children played in the courtyards without fear of whites lurking beyond the horizon, and the words "winter is coming" came to mean something else, not a doom but a reminder that vigilance and unity could overcome even the darkest cold. And late at night, when the wind rustled through the godwood, those who listened carefully might still sense that faint echo of a living presence in the ancient bark mingled with the hush of winter's breath. It was a testament to the unlikeliest alliance ever forged, the day the Night King and the Starks set aside enmity to protect all they knew. While men built their homes and sowed their fields, while lords and ladies schemed or loved or fought, that alliance stood like a silent sentinel carved into the roots of weirwood trees from Eastwatch to the western seas. A boundary of two realms sealed in blood and flame, anchored by a vow that transcended mortal words. For a realm as turbulent as Westeros, it was more than enough. It was hope. It was survival. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was the first step toward understanding that even the most ancient of evils could hold within it a seed of change, provided the living found the courage to meet it without flinching. So passed the months into years, and the story one day would become legend. But for the ones who lived it, the Starks, their allies, and even the Night King, it was simply the truth. The realm had been saved by a bond beyond comprehension, a bond that allowed mankind and Winter's darkest guardian to exist side by side. Each in its own realm, each forever altered by that single, critical choice to stand together against the long night.